Welcome to the University of Michigan Dentistry Podcast Series, promoting oral health care worldwide.
Often neglected phases of treatment planning in partial dentures is the surveying of the diagnostic cast. This aspect of treatment planning is often ignored or relegated to the laboratory man. It should be done in keeping in mind the findings of the oral exam. We've recorded many of the oral findings on this periodontal chart and treatment plan, and these findings should be kept in mind when the surveying of the cast or the diagnostic cast is being done. It will definitely alter the treatment plan knowing these facts. Now, the first step in the survey procedure would be to mount the cast on the base mount or the cast mount of the surveyor. The first instrument in the surveyor that we'll use is the analyzing rod. The analyzing rod in the kit is sometimes bent when it comes from the manufacturer, so that should be checked. It should be perpendicular, and it should be checked by rolling it on the desktop or by using some other gauge such as a right angle to check it against. Another thing that can be used in place of the analyzing rod is a shank of a straight handpiece burr. This will work as well for an analyzing rod. Now, the best starting position for the cast is the most neutral position, which is horizontal to the tabletop or similar to the patient's mouth in the open position. It will allow you to get around over contouring of teeth. If we tilt it one way or the other to any extreme, you'll find that you'll have to over-contour or under-contour crowns in order to get the partial denture into position. And so, since we are determining the path of insertion of the partial, the most neutral position is probably one which is the best for starting. We have to also keep in mind our findings on the oral exam. Now, we found on the oral exam of this patient that the remote molar abutment, potential abutment, has a restoration on it. And this restoration was faulty, and it was going to necessitate crowning with a full gold crown. So with this in mind, this means that we will be altering the wax up of this restoration to any position that we find. So the best place to start the analysis would be on the opposite side, the abutment, potential terminal abutment of the opposite side in the neutral position. Now, as we look at the lingual surface, we find that there is a slight undercut in the cervical 1/3 of that crown. This tooth is caries-free, and the root shape is of such that we probably will not have to splint it to the adjacent tooth. So keeping this in mind at this point, we see there's a slight undercut, but we could probably, with very little planing, get a nice parallel surface on the lingual of this tooth. Now, using this same position, this same beginning neutral position, we'll go to the buccal and look to see if it would have enough of a retentive undercut in this position. And we see that, yes, there is an undercut here. Part of the undercut is formed by a notching of that tooth by toothbrush abrasion, but it is not particularly sensitive to the patient, as we found in our oral exam, and that it is caries-free. So we do have what looks to be an adequate amount of undercut for clasping in the very center of the tooth. That is the area that we would like to have our potential retention. So we've looked at the terminal abutment on the bicuspid side just to make sure that we will not have to over-contour anything. Let's look at the molar on the side which we're thinking we may have to do a restoration, a full crown restoration. Looking at the lingual aspect of this tooth, we see that we do have an undercut, where we would like to have a parallel surface on the restored crown. The undercut is here, so we will have to, in our restoration, in our preparation, reduce the axial surface of that tooth enough so that when the crown is waxed up in the laboratory, we will want a parallel surface here to offset the force of the retentive clasp on the opposite side. Now we'll also go to the buccal surface of that tooth and see what we have here. The buccal surface of the molar tooth is less likely to have an undercut, and we find this is true in this case with the cast in this position. We see there's a very, very slight undercut at the cervical third of the tooth. Not enough undercut for the retention of the cast clasp or a proposed cast clasp on the remote abutment of this class 2 situation. If we move the cast to the mesial slightly, putting the retention even further forward, we may pick up a little bit more retention, but we are not picking up much at all. Now, this means one thing. When we wax, if we choose this as our final path of insertion, when we wax the crown for this abutment, we will have to over-contour the buccal surface in order to pick up the retention. Now, how can I get a little bit more retention on that mesial buccal corner without over-contouring quite that much? One way would be to tilt the cast just slightly forward. This will aid us in picking up a little bit more retention. The height of contour will be placed a little bit higher, and if I do a wax up on this tooth now, perhaps it won't necessarily be quite so over-contoured to pick up adequate retention. I've picked up just a slight amount of undercut right in this area. And we'll have to go back and check the lingual to make sure that if we do a crown, it isn't going to necessarily mean a gross reduction of that lingual surface. It looks just about the same as it did in the previous position. Now, going across the arch again, we're going to have to double check the bicuspid abutment to make sure that it wasn't altered. And I can see that it is altered very, very slightly from the previous position. Going to the buccal surface again to double check. Here I still have adequate retention, more than adequate retention probably. I'll check that with an undercut gauge, but it looks as if I'll have more than adequate retention. Now I'm going to look at the distal aspects of the tooth, the terminal abutment teeth, to check the heights of contour there. And I can see, if I look at the distal surface of that abutment tooth on the surveyor, that I have a fairly parallel surface, and if I apply blockout wax at the blockout phase, I can create a little space in this area to allow for movement of the partial toward the abutment tooth without pushing that abutment tooth forward. This contour I can work around very nicely. Now I'm going to look again at the molar abutment and look at the distal distal of the molar abutment to check its contour. And I see that I have a similar situation. A slight undercut, perhaps almost a parallel surface, but if I put a little blockout wax in that area, I can provide some relief for the necessary relief for the minor connector. Now those are the two primary abutments, and I think that this path of insertion will, suffice for those two crowns. Now I'm going to look the third tooth that we're going to check. The third tooth that the potential partial would check would be the potential indirect retainer spot, which is the first bicuspid on the patient's right side. Looking at the lingual surface of the bicuspid, we see that we do have a small undercut, which, if we need an indirect retainer to come up into this area, it will have to be blocked out in this area. But it is not a gross amount of undercut, and we can work around this amount of undercut very nicely by filling it in with blockout material. Now those are the three areas of the partial that will be contacting the teeth. The two potential abutment teeth and the tooth that I have picked for the indirect retainer on this lower class 2 partial denture. Now the other aspects of this cast that we want to check are the soft tissue areas to see if we have any potential undercuts in the soft tissue area. We have satisfied the requirements of the teeth. Now we're going to see if there are any undercuts on the soft tissue or residual ridge areas that would pose a problem. Now we're looking at the lingual area apical to the molar abutment tooth, and we see that the height of contour in that area is very low and that there is really no undercut. All the area, the space that we see in the analyzing rod is above the point of contact. So this means that the partial will draw in that area over the soft tissue. If we block out this potential undercut, or if we get rid of that with our restored crown. Now going anterior, we're going to look at the soft tissue, and we find out that this is true all the way to the anterior part of the mouth, that the soft tissue is sloping favorably upward for us, and that there is no undercut. There is no undercut in the anterior or the posterior in the soft tissue areas. We're in contact right near the fold, or the fold of the floor of the mouth, where the floor of the mouth meets the residual ridge. That is the greatest diameter of the ridge. So we have no undercuts to contend with on the residual ridge, on the lingual surface. And we're going to cross over and check the buccal for residual ridge undercuts. Now this is probably as far forward as that saddle area is going to go, and we can see in this area a slight undercut. In this area right here, I'm sticking the instrument between the cast and the analyzing rod to show that there is an undercut. The height of contour is high here, where the root for the terminal abutment has made this soft tissue very prominent, and then below that I have an undercut. Now as I come posterior on that side, I lose that undercut when I lose the effect of the root. As I go posterior, I lose that undercut when the root is no longer underlying. And again, as on the lingual surface, the more apical portion or connection of the soft tissue to the ridge is the greatest diameter, and there is no undercut in the ridge in this area. So with this path of insertion, this tentative path of insertion that I've chosen, the only undesirable undercut that I would have to contend with is this slight soft tissue undercut on the bicuspid terminal abutment side. There is no undesirable undercut to speak of in the soft tissue area on the lingual or on the molar side. So as a tentative path of insertion, I'm going to secure the base in this position, and what I want to check now is the tooth, the potential tooth where I don't want to do a restoration, the bicuspid tooth. I want to check and see if there is an adequate undercut. Now, what I'm going to check that with is an undercut gauge. The undercut gauge is so designed to tell me if I have the amount of undercut that I need. We see that the most inferior rim of the gauge is of a wider diameter than the shank of the instrument. And this distance in this particular gauge is 20 thousandths. Now we happen to feel that if we have 20 thousandths undercut, it is more than adequate, and we can clasp any amount of that we need. So I am going to replace the analyzing rod with the undercut gauge and check to see if I have adequate undercut on the potential retentive surface of the bicuspid crown, because here I know that it's caries free, and I would like to determine if I can, if there is an adequate amount of undercut without having to go to either a class 5 restoration or a full crown restoration. Now you can see that 20 thousandths undercut is not that much, and I have it very easily on this tooth. We see this little triangle here, ensuring that at that point, if I brought my clasp at that point with a finished partial denture, I would have engaged 20 thousandths an inch undercut. Now that's for the bicuspid tooth. Now we know that we will have control of the opposite side, our other potential retentive area, our other potential primary abutment being the molar. I really am not too concerned if I don't have quite enough undercut on this tooth, because I'm going to have to restore this tooth with a gold crown. Now I see that I probably do have 20 thousandths undercut in this position. I'm just going to stick the instrument in that area. I do have 20 thousandths undercut, but that brings the retention very low on that tooth, and I can improve that with a gold crown by making that amount of retention up slightly higher so that the clasp, the retentive part of the clasp, does not lie on or near that gingiva. I would prefer, when I have control over the amount of retention, to bring it up just slightly from where it is in this particular situation, so that the clasp unit does not lie on the gingiva. So now that I have all the requirements, both hard tissue, meaning the abutment teeth, I have the requirements fulfilled. I will not have to over-contour greatly. I may have to do a slight amount of disking of the unchanged or the non-restored abutment, my potential non-restored abutment tooth, the tooth without any caries, the bicuspid. A very small amount of disking will probably give me a nice, adequate parallel surface for a guiding plane on the lingual of this abutment tooth. The molar abutment tooth looks like it can be restored without greatly over-contouring to get by any undercuts on the abutment tooth. The indirect retainer position, potential indirect retainer position, the first bicuspid on the right side, it has a slight undercut, which we can probably block out to get around very nicely. And then in this position, the only soft tissue undercut that I have to contend with is the buccal surface of the buccal surface of the residual ridge area, this area. This is the only soft tissue undercut that I have to deal with. Now I can relieve the base in that area just that minor amount to get around that undercut. If I try to tilt the cast to get around that undercut, I'm going to change all the desirable effects that I have on these hard tooth, or the hard structure, or the remaining teeth. All their curvatures will be for naught, and just to get around this one undercut on the soft tissue, and it's just not enough to warrant it. So I will choose this as the slightly forward tilt from the neutral position as my final design and my final position for surveying. Now I want to be able to position this cast again in this same position if I take it off the surveyor. So I'm going to mark the cast by etching it with a sharp instrument. I'm going to mark the cast in two planes so that I can reposition the cast in this position. This merely will be taking an instrument and going along that analyzing rod of an adequate length. The longer the mark is, the better. And it will etch the cast, and I can accentuate that etching by marking it with a pencil. Now that is very visible, and we can reposition the cast in that plane. Now one other plane we'll have to choose in order to determine this position. We'll have to have a marking in another plane, and we'll mark that on the side of the base of the diagnostic cast. Again, we etch it in. We don't just draw a line with a pencil, because that line may abrade off. And again, I'll just mark it with a pencil for visibility. Now I have that position. I am able to take this cast off the surveyor, and I can reposition this cast in the same position, but I want to make sure that you understand it's only this cast, because if I take another cast and try to position it in this position, the base will be different, and so my markings will have nothing to do with repositioning a different cast, only the same cast. It will be necessary to tripod, which we will do a little bit later, to reposition a different cast in the same of the same mouth in this same position. So let's go. One other thing that we will do while we have the cast in this position is to mark the heights of contour on the teeth and the ridge to show where the framework will have to be, or where the cast will have to be blocked out prior to making a framework, or where we will have to change certain heights of contour. To do this, we use a carbon marker. Now the carbon is merely a cylindrical or parallel piece of carbon which can be inserted in the surveyor. Now this carbon is very fragile and will break if we tighten the screw as we insert it into the surveyor. So we're going to use a metal shield which wraps around the carbon just see, it is of a half moon shape, and it merely wraps around the carbon, and that part of the carbon we will place toward the set screw. Now I'll then secure that firmly, but not really bearing down on it so that the carbon does not fracture. Now I can go around my diagnostic cast and mark where the heights of contour are, and we'll start on the potential abutment teeth, and I'm going to mark the lingual surface. It may be necessary to raise and lower the analyzing rod as we go along so that the base of it does not touch the cast. Now this is very desirable to have this undercut low on the distal aspect of that tooth so that a clasp unit, as it is coming down from the minor connector, does not engage an undercut. This is desirable to have this undercut low in this area. And we see that the undercut, as it's marked on the buccal surface, is in the cervical 1/3 of the crown of that tooth. Now, while I'm here, I'm going to go down and I'm going to mark this undercut. Remember, I said we had an undercut in this bicuspid area, and I'm going to mark that undercut on the cast. We can see that undercut. There's a slight drop of wax there, which is not marking perfectly, but we get a good idea of where that undercut is. Now, there's no sense in marking all the way back, but we see that there is no undercut back on the buccal surface. Now, we'll go to the opposite molar tooth now, the opposite side, the molar abutment, and just mark the undercut on that tooth. We'll see its height of contour. Now we can't use an analyzing rod or one of these graphite rods forever because it'll go out of round and we will no longer be getting an adequate representation of the undercut. But for this purpose, I'm sure we can use one rod for this case all the way around. And we see that this buccal surface is of nice contour because the height of contour is low back here and it swings up, and so our clasp could lie above the height of contour till it reaches the retentive area on the mesial buccal and then would go into this undercut. So when when the crown is waxed up, the restored crown, this tooth has a faulty amalgam, remember. When this restored crown is waxed up, we can move the height of contour up maybe just a slight amount or bring it out just to increase our retention, over contour it slightly, but we'll want the general contour of the waxed crown to be the same as is shown here. Now, the other area we mentioned where the partial would have to be in contact with the teeth would be potential indirect retainer area. In that indirect retainer area, let me just tilt this cast up a little bit. The potential indirect retainer area is the point that's furthest from a line going from the occlusal rest area to occlusal rest area. Now the line that is the most perpendicular to that and the furthest forward that would provide a positive rest seat is this bicuspid area, this bicuspid-cuspid area. And the mesial fossa of that tooth is a natural recipient for an indirect retainer. So as I look at this, when I am surveying it, I'm keeping in mind that that's the probable position of an indirect retainer. So I'll mark the height of contour also on that tooth. Now that's the only other tooth. Well, we might we'll keep in mind that we might put an indirect retainer in this area also if the floor of the mouth is high, and as I recall, this floor of the mouth was high. I remember in the oral examination measuring it with the periodontal probe and then making a notation of how far it is, and I've indicated that on the cast. So if we're going to use another indirect retainer, it will probably be in this mesial fossa here, and of this abutment tooth. It would probably just be the mesial fossa of the primary abutment tooth. And I have the undercut marked in that area. That undercut is very, very minimal, and it can be easily worked around. Again, we can go to the distal and start to mark the residual ridge, the height, and I see that it's very low. There is no high height of contour. And I'm just coming along and getting, I'm not going to mark at all, an idea of where that reflection is of the soft tissue to the cast. Now as I get into the area where of the terminal abutment teeth where there is a root again to contend with, I can see that as I go, if I go very low, I get an almost parallel surface in this area. Parallel to slightly undercut, perhaps. Very, very minimal. That's probably out of the potential range of our major connector, so I'm not too concerned about that undercut. It'll have to be relieved in that area slightly anyway. So now then I have all my heights of contour marked on the cast, on the abutment teeth, on the potential indirect retainer teeth, and on the soft tissues. So now I know exactly where I'll have to block out, or where I would either have to block out or alter the existing curvature of the tooth in order to get the partial denture in position. Now, the one last thing that I'm going to do is to tripod this case. Tripoding is merely taking 3 points which are unlikely to change on another impression of the same mouth and marking them in one plane so that I can take another cast of the same mouth and reposition it on the surveyor in the same position. Now I'll look around for points that will not change from impression to impression. And areas that I want to look at are probably areas such as the junction of the tooth to that free gingival margin on the cast. That's not likely to change from impression to impression. Areas on the teeth themselves, such as cingulums, etc. Creases in the residual ridge that are not highly movable can also be used. So I'm going to look around the cast for such marks. Now I'm just going to see if I start out with this area on the lingual aspect of that anterior tooth and see if I can match it up with anything, and I have difficulty matching it to anything on this residual ridge or anything that seems to be too low to really get anything that's of importance. So let's go a little bit higher, and I'll attempt to go to this junction where these teeth come in contact interproximally with each other. That would be a reproducible position. And try to keep that in the same plane with maybe several others. Okay, I'll go from there and search for another position. I'm going way around to the buccal surface, and I can't duplicate that any place. Maybe I could, if I use this bicuspid area, I could use the cervical of that right there to reposition it. I'll see if I can find anything better. Let's see if I need 3 points widely spread. I could probably use this crease on this side, about halfway down the length of that crease to indicate it. Let me try one more. Maybe the height of that incisal edge and see where that comes in relationship to other things. And it looks as if I use that, I could probably use the junction of this molar tooth with the gingiva as another plane. Let's just double check. That was just came down a little bit. Okay, I'll use the incisal edge there. As I go back to this side, I can probably touch it and mark a spot here on that crease, which would be crease in soft tissue, which would be reproducible. So let's start to mark those 2 points. Okay, I put a mark there. To delineate this mark from the other marks of the height of contour that we've already made, we'll put an X and a circle around that to make sure that we know that is one of the tripod marks. Now we'll do that on 3 of the marks that we've selected. The other is this area in the anterior where the incisal edges are. And then we'll pick the 3rd point. Now these points should be as far away from each other as possible. It'll make it a little bit easier. Right here at the distal aspect where the gingiva and the tooth meet. Now the center of those marks is the tripod point. Now this tripoding will enable us to take the master cast later on in the construction sequence and position it in very nearly this same position on the articulator. Tripoding enables you to take a different cast of the same mouth and position it in the same place on the surveyor, whereas marking on the base of the cast allows you to position the same cast in the same position on the articulator. Now that we have the diagnostic cast surveyed and the heights of contour marked and it is tripoded, we can go to the design and design problem and design the partial denture framework on the diagnostic cast.
You've been listening to a presentation from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, which is dedicated to supporting open learning and open educational resources. This recording is licensed under the Creative Commons. It may be reused and redistributed for nonprofit use. Please attribute materials to the University of Michigan School of Dentistry and redistribute under this same license. For more information on how this and other University of Michigan School of Dentistry recordings may be used, visit www.dent.umich.edu/license.